Okay, let's finish up with colonialism. There are very few, issues with regard to political geography that are as profound as colonialism. It affects so much of what happened 400 plus years ago, plus what's going on today as well. All right, so what is colonialism? It's the practice of establishing political dominance. You go in, you take over, you physically take over the land, right? You physically take over the government. You control the economics, you control the territory, right? And the people who live there as well. Colonialism may be somewhat confusing with imperialism, right? Colonialism kind of assumes that there's nobody there, right? That you go in and you take over a land that doesn't belong to anybody else. But we do not necessarily, that's not true, because of the fact that when the United Kingdom came over and France and Spain came over and colonialized the Americas, there were people living there. When Europe colonized Africa, there were people living there. Imperialism is a little bit different in that you are going into an area that is politically organized. Politically organized. Now, in the 1800s, were there areas of Africa that was politically organized? Of course there was. But imperialism is kind of just taken over, right? People wanted to have an empire, so they went in. The United States did it to areas of the Caribbean, right? The Philippines, Guam, Midway, as well. Right? Colonialism has had a profound impact because the colonizing country goes in, and not only does it take control, but it usually takes resources, whether that be raw materials. It could be anything from rubber to trees to coal to oil, right? Crops. It could also mean people, right? Physically taking people and making them go places, right? And they do it for their benefit. A lot of times what they will do is take the raw materials from the colony, take it back to the colonizing country, make something out of it, turn it into something, right? And then turn around and sell it back to the colony. So they are getting free labor, free resources, right? They are then taking it back and making it into something which they can turn around and sell for a lot of money. Right? So that's one of the ways that a colonizing country makes money, right? That mercantilism that we've talked about before, right? They just go in and they take it, plunder, right? Or they tax it, or they use it, the colony as a market in order to sell their materials, right? The fact that Europe was the primary colonizing continent, right, allowed them to get the head start, right? They are the ones who grab all the money, and they've held on to that money for hundreds and hundreds of years. They are still the wealthiest area of the world, and they are able to continue that because they have put other countries down. They use those countries to prop them up, and those countries really haven't ever recovered. The United States, although it was a colony, got its independence awfully early, so it too was able to come into the market to take advantage of, well, not necessarily colonizing many places, but it was able to take advantage of its resources, its expertise, and its population in order to become an incredibly wealthy country, an incredibly dominant country as well. So colonizing, if you get a question that asks about core, periphery, semi-periphery, make sure you include colonialization because of the fact that it really had such a profound impact. Today we are still seeing countries in the periphery, right, or a lot of those countries who didn't achieve their independence till much later than everybody else. And they were unable to find a colony to step on in order to advance their particular status, move them from periphery into a semi-periphery or even a core area. All right, let's move on. All right, shapes of countries. Countries have multiple different shapes, and they have, this can affect their political geography. Compact countries, like you see Cambodia up there at the top, right, are easier to defend, easier to get to if you have here's your capital, Phnom Penh, right, and you have some kind of disturbance over here. it's easier to get your country from the capital, or get your military from the capital to the country, or relief services to this area than it is in a country that's much wider spread apart or has some kind of obstacles that you can get to. Most compact states are relatively small, right? The United States, not necessarily compact, and it certainly is not very small. But political boundaries are much more easy to monitor and take care of. Let's look at an elongated country. In this case, we're looking at Vietnam. Chile would also be an example of an elongated country. The capital is here, Hanoi, way in the north. And to get all the way down here can be an issue. It is also an issue that people in the north, right, may not see themselves the same way as the people in the south. Right, you may have this inability to keep people united as Vietnamese. Right, they may see themselves as regional or cultural groups might attract them more than necessarily the national group because of the fact that they're just so far apart. And additionally, when your capital's so up farther north from you, it's easy to feel like they are not responsive to you. Let's look at a fragmented country down here, the Philippines, right, made up of a bunch of different islands, right? And again, the capital is here, right? You're on an island way over here. To get your army from one place to another, or your emergency people from one place to another, of course, you have to go over either through air or through the water. Right? Smaller countries obviously may not have any kind of an airport, so that may make it difficult to get from one place to another. Also, too, very fragmented population. People on this island may see themselves differently from this island. I don't know which one, but one of these islands here in the south has been fought over between the Filipino government and a Muslim radical group because they want to have one of these islands down here for themselves, right, to create a Muslim country. And it makes it hard, right, if you're this far away. Also, let's look at South Africa, a perforated country, right? Okay, in a perforated country like you see in South Africa, you have basically an entire country, that's that little country of Lesotho, that is completely inside of the borders of South Africa. How is that can be a problem? Obviously, if you have a country inside of your borders that doesn't think like you, doesn't agree with your policies, that can cause some issues. Think about it with regard to in the coronavirus. If you have some counties doing some type of stay-at-home and a next county doing something else, right? You will have people that will crossing back and forth, so that can become a problem. If you have, let's say, here's Lesotho, and let's say that Lesotho was another country that continued over here, right? We would have what's called an exclave, right? An exclave is a portion of a country that's geographically separated from the mainland. So Alaska would be an exclave. If you guys remember looking at the map of Europe, there's that little area called Kaliningrad, which is a part of Russia, though it's not attached to Russia. That's used to give them a port that doesn't freeze on the Baltic. You also have, there's a little place in Western Africa that has the same area as well. Right? Lesotho is also landlocked, which means it has no port. It doesn't have access to a port unless South Africa grants them access. They can certainly fly, but they can't travel over land. That could be a problem if South Africa gets mad and says, no, I'm going to shut you down. All right, the last kind we're going to look at is a prorupted, and that's, protruded, sometimes called prorupted. That's here, Thailand, right? You kind of have a compact portion of the state up here, right? But you have this little large protruding area that comes down. Again, it's an area that's kind of separated. It's apart from the rest of the country. It doesn't always make it easy to get to, whether you go over land or you have to go by sea in order to get there. All right. One of the next things we're going to talk about are supranational organizations. And we talked about this kind of at the end of this chapter, where we talked about the fact that while the state is still the preeminent region for political geography, it is kind of being taken over by supranational organizations. Right? Those are organizations of 3 or more states that come together for a common purpose. Right? Let's look at NAFTA. It's not called NAFTA anymore, but I'm not going to worry about the new name. Right? So NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Right? We're neighbors. How can we best take advantage of our situation as neighbors? We have eliminated certain tariffs when we import goods across the lines. We have not really done away with the requirements for people crossing. In fact, in some ways, that since NAFTA has been more restrictive, you used to be able to cross the borders with birth certificates. Now everybody has to have a passport. So people moving back and forth, it's really more trade, right? It's goods that we can trade from one area to the other. As we restrict immigration between the 3 countries, that can cause a problem for NAFTA. But other countries use it for something different. We talked about the European Union, how it started as a small confederation of 3 states, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, the Benelux countries. They're very small, and they are located here, right? These 3 small countries between England, France, and Germany, much larger, more developed, and politically powerful countries than these little guys. And so what they said was, look, there's strength in numbers. Let's get together, the 3 of us, negotiating contracts, trade agreements, and what have you. We might get better results than we do if we try to do it on our own. They also eliminated tariffs between the 3. And what started with these 3 countries has now grown into what we know as the European Union. It was very successful. The United Nations is another type of supranational organization. It's not necessarily trade-based, although there is some negotiations about trade barriers between countries. But the United Nations is really a place where people can go to resolve their issues. They can go and agree that they will abide by certain standards of conduct, and they can try to work on things as a whole, as opposed to, singularly. They also can have, expanded into dealing with refugees, with issues regarding children, with UNICEF around the world, in order to try to better, people's lives. There are also supranational organizations like NATO, the North Atlantic Trade Organization, which is a military organization, and it was put together after World War II to try to contain communism, right? To try to keep the former Soviet Union from encroaching into Eastern Europe further than it already had. So it's the western part of Europe, United States, that were getting together to try to prevent that. Soviet Union had their own called the Warsaw Pact with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries that they had taken into that as well. So supranational organizations, if you get a question about that, you might want to talk about the idea of globalization, right? The threat to culture, the threat to industrialization of other countries if you have these big countries getting together to beat up on little countries. You might have some discussion about that. All right, the next one we're going to talk about are political geography theories. Right, we talked about 2. We started with the German school, and that's represented on the left, right, by Mr. Ratzel. He envisioned countries as living, breathing organisms that needed to have living space, or Lebensraum, right? That they needed to grow because the population grew, their reach grew, and so you can see a vision here of what might have happened. All right, I'm going to have to stop here and pick up on the next one.